scriptures. So for people that learn like me, it'll be great. If you turn your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 17. I did not. I talk soft? Oh. Okay. I mean, I can yell and scream if people want me to. 1 Samuel chapter 17. 1 Samuel chapter 17. You guys have probably heard the story before about David and Goliath. In the interest of time, as you have. Basically, a guy named David, a guy named Goliath, he killed them. Everyone went home. They were happy. The end. All right, let's pray. No, so as we go through this, I'm going to go through most of the chapter, which is a fairly long chapter, so we'll move relatively quickly. We'll try to not be here as long as 9 hours, as my lovely wife has pointed out that I preach. But as we're going through this chapter, I would like to keep in mind 3 different groups of people and think about them in relation to how this passage plays out. So the 3 different groups of people, or people specifically, the first one's going to be David, which is kind of a given story of David and Goliath. The second one is going to be the Israelites. And then also, in addition to just the Israelites, keep in mind that the Israelites were, as we know, the people of God. And so we'll look at a couple of ways how their actions also have parallels to the people of God now, which would, of course, be the Christian church in today's day and age. And then the third group of people is the Philistines, and also throw Goliath in with the Philistines as well, because he was, in fact, a Philistine. So as we're going through here, just keep in mind those 3 groups of people as we go through the passage. So we'll start in verse 1 of 1 Samuel chapter 17. Now the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle, and were gathered together at Shochoh, which belongeth to Judah, and pitched between Shochoh and Azekah and Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together and pitched by the valley of Elah, and set the battle in array against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, and there was a valley between them. And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. And he had an helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. And he had greaves of brass upon his legs, and a target of brass between his shoulders. And the staff of his spear was like a beaver's wing. His spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And one bearing the shield went before him. And he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel, and said unto them, Why are you come out to set your battle in array? And not I a Philistine, and ye servants of Saul? Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me. If he be able to fight with me, and to kill me, then will we be your servants. But if I prevail against him, servants, and serve us, that we may fight together. Then Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, or when Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So with that section, going back to the beginning of it, I'm just going to point out in each of the sections that I go through several things that I think are important to take a look at, as I kind of mentioned. So one of the first things to see here is Israel, when they come to this fight, they're preparing for battle. As we'll see in just a minute, one of the verses that I'm going to bring up, this is not something terribly unusual for them, for the Philistines to come and fight them. This has been going on for quite some time, and the Philistines come, they're a threat to their country and to their livelihood, and so they go to fight them, which, as the people of God or as Christians, if we have threats to our way of life and to what God has given us, we should fight against it. Unfortunately, their reactions, as you guys know and as we'll see, are less than super stellar. But basically, the Philistines come out, and so do the Israelites, and they line up for battle. And as you guys have probably seen in some of the older movies and stuff that are super epics with 8 people as actors, I was always kind of curious as, hey, what kind of battlefield are we actually looking at for this battle? Because in some of the movies, you've got the Israelites here, like on that side of the room. You've got the Philistines, they're on that side of the room, and then you've got 2 people fighting in the middle. Well, they make a circle around them because that's what's in the Bible. So Slide, please. All right, so here you can see it's a little small, but as you can see here, here's a map of the actual Valley of Elah as it is today. You can kind of see here on the far side of the valley over there, it says Philistine camp, and so that's kind of where they are, and the Israelite camp is on the near side on this mountain. So when it says they're on one mountain and the other mountain, we're talking, it's a pretty big distance. You got that huge valley through there. It looks like it's probably farmland or something like that now. But that's where the Israelites, and it says the Israelites are on one mountain, the Philistines are on another mountain, and they talk about they set up their array for battle. It doesn't really give a whole lot more details than that, but presumably they're coming down probably to the bottom of the mountain or something along those lines, lining up for battle in the battlefield. And so as they line up, then the first day when they line up in this particular instance, Goliath comes out, and presumably this is something new for them. They never mentioned Goliath before in the Bible, and we never really see them running like scared little chickens. However, there may be some other stuff going into that as well. So Goliath comes out, and I didn't realize until I was preparing for this lesson, but apparently Goliath's size is quite a topic of discussion among the world. We'll just leave it at that. And I think probably one of the reasons for that is, as we know, people want to degrade the truth of the Bible, say that's just mythical, can't possibly be true. As we see here, the Bible says he's 6 cubits and a span. Now, the Bible doesn't specifically say in inches, as we know it today, what that equals to. We assume it's someplace in the neighborhood of 9 feet 9 inches. And we get that number from how big a cubit is, which a cubit is a kind of imprecise measurement, as a lot of the measurements were back then, but it's from your elbow to your fingertip, which is on average about 18 inches for an adult human being. And a span is 1/2 of that, or approximately that far, which 1/2 of a cubit, which is what it equaled, is 9 inches, which is how we get 9 feet 9 inches. And some people say, well, that couldn't possibly be real. He's not really that tall because Israelites were small people. And that's true. They were smaller than the average American now, or a lot of other races around the world. But even if so I did the math on that and calculated for that. And even if you take a 2-inch shorter cubit, because they're significantly shorter, you're still talking almost 9 feet, like 8 feet 9 inches, so 8 3/4 feet, something like that. Now, I'm not saying he was actually that short. If you're going to use that logic, you also have to go the other way, which is, well, what if we're talking about one of the people like Goliath? Well, if you go the other way and you go for a 20-inch cubit, it's 2 inches longer than the average cubit. Now you're talking almost 11 feet tall. So it's kind of poor math, in my opinion, if you do that, or a poor argument. Some of the translations of the Bible, including the Septuagint, as you guys may know, is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and it actually changed it and said 4 cubits in a span. Now, whether that was a typo or whether somebody said this couldn't possibly be correct, that he was actually that tall, I don't know. But that comes in about 6 feet 9 inches, which is significantly shorter. But I think that's probably an inaccurate translation. There's actually an English translation. I believe it's the New English translation, which says he was almost 7 feet tall. I think that's, which would be 6 feet 9 inches, coming up with that number. I think that's probably incorrect. And one of the reasons for that, if you go to the next slide real quick, actually, please. One of the reasons for that, I think, that is incorrect is because of the weight of his armor. So people say, he's carrying about 130 pounds of armor. That's not true. And people now, they say, well, that's not too much more than our soldiers now carry, which is actually in the neighborhood of 90-ish pounds with all their armor, all their gear, their back and everything. But if you look at it, it actually says his coat of mail was 5,000 shekels, which comes out to about 125 to 130 pounds, someplace in there. A shield, 50 pounds of gear, not including his spear, which is approximately 50 pounds is the head of the spear. And I don't know about you guys, but 15 pounds is pretty significant, especially when it's on the end of a stick. If you take a standard sledgehammer, which you guys know what that is, I don't know how many of you have tried to hold up a sledgehammer like this. Me too. Not really easy, and a standard sledgehammer is only 8 pounds. So you're talking almost twice that weight on the size of a javelin or a spear. Obviously, you've got a shaft, so you've got some balancing, but that's a lot of weight to be able to wield. And Goliath is a formidable warrior, so we're not talking about somebody that he has it to look cool. He can actually wield this stuff and fight. So I think we're talking a huge guy. But as you can see here, just for comparison, when we get to David, this they say 9 feet 6 inches, a little shorter than 9 feet 9, but whatever. But just for a general visual comparison, you've got a guy, David, as we'll see later, he is a young man, probably, and being a Jewish man, he's a little bit shorter than that, so they estimate about 5'2", and then he's got Shaq in there. I don't know if you guys seen the pictures of Shaq, like with his girlfriend and stuff. She looks tiny, and that's about what we're talking about for the size of David, probably someplace in that size, maybe slightly bigger, and you can see the difference David is to Shaq now, what Shaq is to Goliath. I mean, you're talking huge. You're not talking in some of the movies where, oh, there's a big guy, Andre the Giant, 7 feet tall, and he's big. We're talking almost twice as high. You're talking a comparison of basically Zeke to me. And then, obviously, as you get exponentially bigger, weight differential becomes even larger. So, does Zeke have a slingshot? No. I don't want him to shoot me in the head. Anyway, so yeah, just for comparison, we're looking at Goliath. That's kind of what we're dealing with. And when we start talking about David and reactions to things. So the next part, if you look at verse 8, Goliath comes out and he goes, why are you why are you come out to set your battle in array? Now, most people just kind of gloss over this. But what's kind of interesting about this particular phrase and the way it's presented is it appears that Israel's not doing something that's normal custom for battles at the time, because he wouldn't have come out and said, hey, you guys are here and I'm here, let's save people. That's not what he said. He goes, why are you guys preparing for battle? I'm here, you're here, let's send out 2 people and fight. So already we're starting to see that the Israelites' tactics are kind of the norm, or at least not completely abnormal. But as we see, when Goliath comes out, in verse 11, it says Saul and all of Israel heard the words, and they're greatly terrified, or greatly afraid, as it says. And it's interesting that they specifically say Saul and all of Israel, and I think there's probably several reasons for this. One of them being that Saul, obviously, is the king of Israel at the time. One of the other ones, if you're looking for an obvious chapters to 1 Samuel chapter 9, when Samuel first anoints Saul king of Israel, they specifically mentioned, and there was not among the children of Israel a goodlier person than he. From his shoulders and upward, he was higher than any of the people. So he's significantly bigger than anyone else. This is a huge contrast from his earlier life, and even just a chapter or 2 in the Bible before this particular passage. As you saw, he's fighting these wars, God's doing all these things for him. But just 2 chapters earlier, at the end of chapter 15, this is when God tells him, go kill Agag, go wipe out everybody. He does it. And Samuel comes up and he's like, dude, what did you do? And then Samuel has to go and hack the God to pieces, which is possibly one of my favorite Bible stories, but I digress. But at that time, after he does that, he disobeys God. And then it says in 1 Samuel 15, verse 35, and the Lord repented that he made Saul king over Israel. And then in the next chapter, chapter 16, it says, but the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. So we see this contrast of him being a mighty warrior where the Spirit of God is upon him. He's doing all these mighty things, protecting his country and his nation, and then God leaves him. And he's scared, and this is one of the evidences of it. We don't know if it's the first battle after the Lord departs from him, but it's pretty soon after that, based on the chronology of the Bible, and he's scared, and he runs like a scared chicken just like everybody else. So that's kind of the setup for it. And then the next several verses we're actually going to skip over from. Basically, this is the part where Jesse says, hey, go take cheese to your brothers, to David, and he does. And that's basically what that is. So we'll skip that part just for the sake of time, drop down to verse 20. And it says, and David rose up early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper and took and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the trench as the host was going forth to the fight and shouted for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had put the battle in array, army against army. And David left his carriage in the hand of the keeper of the carriage and ran to the army and brethren. And as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, and spake according to the same words that he had said previously. And David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were sore afraid. And when the men of Israel said, the men of Israel said, have you seen this man that is come up? Surely to defy Israel is he come up. And it shall be that the man who killeth him, the king will enrich him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. And David spake to the men that stood by him, saying, What shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him after this manner, saying, So shall it be done to the man that killeth him. And Eliab his eldest brother heard when he spake unto the men. And Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, Why camest thou down hither? And with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know thy pride and the naughtiness of thine heart, for thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle. And David said, What have I now done? Is there not a cause? And he turned from him former manner. Now in this section, if you go back to the beginning of the section in verse 21, we see that the Israelites are they're forming up their battle array. And this is interesting because once again, these are the people of God, and these people, a lot of them are in Saul's army. They've had this history of seeing these amazing, basically miraculous victories that God has given them. And so they line up for battle, and then every single time they get scared and they run away. And if you drop to back to verse 16, which we skipped that one, you see that this has been going on for 40 days, and Goliath is coming out morning and evening. So somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 plus times this has come out. They line up for battle. They're like, they're screaming, yelling, And then Goliath comes out, and they just run like scared little chickens, which I find kind of interesting. In verse 20, it uses the word trench. He comes up to the trench, and so you got these people, and they run up for battle, and then they get scared, and they run. So what pops into my head, of course, which is not correct, by the way, but what pops into my head is you've got these guys, and they're running, shouting, whatever. You've all seen the World War I movies where they have the trench battle, trench warfare. They get scared. Goliath comes out, and they go running, dive headfirst, straight into the trench. Now, that being said, I actually looked up the word trench because I was curious. Sadly, it doesn't mean trench. So they are running away. They're not diving headfirst into a trench. It actually can also be translated away. Like I said, we're not really sure. Maybe they're running up the hill to where their camp is, but they're running away from the battlefield. What's interesting about this is, like I said, if you look at them as a parallel to God's people today, we see this unfortunately a lot in Christians today, in the church today, which is people, they want to fight, and I'll say it that way because they posture like they're going to fight. The threat comes, the hardships come, and they pretend like they're going to fight, but at the moment that there's a real threat or a real potential threat, they run scared, and then they go and hide, and then you come out the next day, and you come out the next day, and you come out the next day. And I'm not going to stand here and tell you that there's not forgiveness and grace from God, because there 100% is, but if you're one of those people that sins, comes to church, goes, I'm so sorry, and then you go home and you sin again for a week, and then you come back to church and you go, I'm so sorry, and then you go home and you sin again for a week. That's kind of the idea of what's going on here, is they're pretending like they want to fight, but they're not backing it up with anything. And like I said, so after 40 days of this going on, they're still running. And then if you go to verse 25, so this is where it kind of gets interesting, and there's a lot of different commentaries out there. I read through several of them. Some of them I completely disagree with, and I'll actually bring some of those up here in a second. But people have said, not Jesus. David was very interested in the reward because he asks 3 times about what's the reward for the person that kills Goliath. Well, if you actually read what the Bible says, that's not true. He asks 1 time, and in a second I'll explain why I think that's not actually even an ask. But anyway, so the people run away scared, and they dive into their trench, because that's what I'm going to go with because it sounds better. And the people say, have you seen this man, what he can do? And this is what the king's going to do. If you read that slightly different inflection, I think it's possibly more accurate to what they're actually doing with this phrase, rather than saying, there's this big guy, you should go kill him because there's a reward. They come out and they dive in, and then they peer out and they see David there, who perhaps didn't run back quite as quickly to their camp. And they say, have you seen this man who's come out? He's so scary. And obviously this is a big deal because the king's going to do all these things for him. He's going to make him rich. He's going to give him his daughter. He's going to make his family free of taxes, which, I don't know how that was back in Israel. Could you imagine what you would have to do in America to not have to pay taxes anymore? Clearly they're building this up to be this is a huge, big thing, which I'm not saying it wasn't. But what's interesting about this particular response from them is the indication in chapter 18 that what they're saying might actually not be 100% accurate. It might actually be an exaggeration of what's going on. And the reason I say that is because of Saul's daughter. So in chapter 18 and verse 17 through 19 is where Saul says to David, so David's been fighting, comes and fights with him, he's doing a whole bunch of battles and winning stuff, and Saul's mad at him because people like him better. And so Saul comes to him and he goes, hey, I'll give you my oldest daughter to marry, but you have to fight all my battles for me. I'm hoping that, he doesn't say this part, but it says in there, he's hoping that the Philistines will kill him, and he doesn't have to do it himself, because he wants to get rid of David, but he doesn't want to get rid of him because the people like him, so maybe we can get. But what's interesting is that here he's offering him his daughter, allegedly again, if this was true, which leads me to believe that perhaps that part might have been blown out of proportion. And then Saul turns around, and he gives his eldest daughter to somebody else to marry, not even David, after even promising him. So I'm not going to stand here and say Saul was the most honest of men at this point in his life. However, there is some indications that what they're saying might be blown out of proportion. And if that's the case, it lends credence to the fact that they're trying to justify why they're running scared. And so then if you look at it in light of that, in the next verse, David's reaction to them, like I said, this is the only time in here it actually says that he asks about the reward. And I don't know that he's actually asking about the reward, because once again, if you take a slightly different inflection with his question, they say, oh, this is a huge deal. The king's going to give all this free, all this stuff, and he's going to make him rich and all this. And David says, what shall be done to the man who kills this unclean Philistine? And if you look at it like that, it's more of a, he's incredulous. He's in disbelief. He's like, this is just, and he says it there, he's like, this is just an uncircumcised pagan who's defying the armies of God, and you're going to do all this for killing one guy? And again, I'm not here to say that's definitely what's going on here, but it seems like from the context that that's a quite likely possibility that that's more of what's going on there. So he's not actually asking about the reward. He's like, whoa, what? Say again? Type of idea. And then the next part is his oldest brother's reaction. And so his oldest brother, this is interesting too, because one of the commentaries specifically I read talk about how David's a sneaky little dude. And he's just interested about getting the girl and the money and all this kind of stuff. And clearly that's true, because his oldest brother says the same thing, and clearly older brothers know best. I find that to be quite improbable. Maybe he's jealous. If he is basically in his response saying, why are you guys a bunch of scared little girls? And in verse 26, he actually says there, he says, what shall be done for the man that killeth this Philistine and taketh away the reproach from Israel? Basically saying, what's going to happen for the person that kills this guy and makes you guys stop looking like a bunch of scared little girls? I mean, that's essentially what he's saying. And you could see why his brother, who is also one of these people who's running scared, doesn't like that very much. And so his brother, when he responds, he says, it does look like he's probably, we already know from just this passage that some of what he's saying is already not true, because he's like, well, why'd you even come down here? You just came down here to watch the battle. Well, we know he came down because Jesse told him to. That's why he was there in the first place. And then also, you see the part of him trying to belittle his brother. He's like, who'd you even leave those few little sheep with in the wilderness? From the context, from the previous chapter, you see that Jesse was maybe not one of the elders of the city, but he seemed like he was a fairly prominent member of the city, which means the likelihood that he had only a few little sheep is pretty low. So it was probably a decent-sized flock that he had. So you kind of see this idea of his brother belittling him and trying to make him look bad, because he doesn't like the fact that his brother's basically showing him up, even though he hasn't done anything other than use words at this point. So you see that reaction. And also you see from his brother in the previous chapter when Samuel comes to anoint David, when Eliab, his oldest brother, is the first one brought forth, and Samuel goes, oh, clearly this is the guy that's going to be the king. And God tells him, hey, this is not him. Don't look at the outward appearance. Look at his heart. And God, he says there, God tells Samuel, he says, don't look not on his countenance or on the height of his stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord seeth not as man seeth, for the man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. So clearly his heart's not right in the right spot necessarily. We do know from Scripture that David is a man after God's own heart. So between the two of them, who's right? I would tend towards the side of David. That's just the way I look at it. And so then the next part, you have him, he asks again, and then in verse 31, we'll pick up there again. And when the words were heard which David spake, they rehearsed them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, Let no man's heart fail him because of him. Speaking of Goliath. Thy servant will fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, Thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. And David said unto Saul, Thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock, and I went out after him, and smote him, and delivered him out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and smote him, and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing that he hath defied the armies of the living God. David said, Moreover, the Lord hath delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear. He will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said unto David, Go, and the Lord be with thee. And Saul armed David with his armor, and put an helmet of brass upon his head. Also he armed him with a coat of mail. And David girded his sword upon his armor, and he essayed to go, for he had not proved it. And David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them. And David took them off him. So what you see in this passage when David first comes to Saul, you see David's belief. And what you see all throughout this passage is, well, the people are scared of Goliath. They're scared of the physical. David keeps bringing it around to God over and over. This is about God. This is about the armies of God. And he refers to multiple times throughout this text the armies of Israel. He doesn't call them the armies of Israel or the armies of Saul. He calls them the armies of the living God, which also is important because of what he says to Goliath and what Goliath had actually said, but how David took it, which is Goliath says, You servants of Saul, you army of Israel. And when David goes up to see him, we'll see this in a minute, he refers to them as the armies of the living God, which he also says several times when he's talking to the Israelites as well, which is David takes the Israelite army, or mockery of the Israelite army, as an affront to God, basically. He goes, you don't get to make fun of God's people, is how he's taking it. But you see this, and he goes up and he's like, hey, I'm going to go fight him. Don't worry about it. I got you. And obviously Saul has this disbelief. He goes, you can't even fight him. He goes, you can't fight him. You're not good enough to fight him. And then David goes into the story talking about the lion and the lamb, which we've all heard. And what's interesting about this is he's talking about a couple of things. He's talking about, hey, God has already helped me in the past. I'm sure of this. But what's interesting for us to learn about this is he's also showing that before, Goliath, and everyone's like, oh, it's a huge thing. He went and fought Goliath, which I'm not saying it isn't. But he goes to fight Goliath, and it's not like God chucked him right in there against Goliath. God had taken him through these times in his life where he gives him smaller trials, if you will, where he's prepared him. He's given him that experience, and he's given him that faith in God. And we see in Romans chapter 5 in verse 3, and it says, And not only so, but we glory in tribulations also, knowing that tribulation worketh patience, and patience experience, and experience hope. And so we see here, this is a common theme for God, which is even in our lives, God's not going to, I'm going to say it. God's not going to throw you into something that you have never, ever, even remotely seen before, and you can't handle because it's too big and scary. The way God works is he puts us through things, and we don't understand sometimes why he puts us through things, but he puts us through those things to build our faith in him so that we know by the time it gets really, really, really hard, hey, God's taking care of me. And, as pastors talk about in his experiences as a missionary and through Bible school and stuff, he's had those same experiences in his life where it seemed impossible, started out kind of smaller, and they got progressively bigger and bigger, where he's had those same things in his life where God's preparing him and building his faith. And we see the same thing here with David. And then David says, after talking about this story, hey, I've got this history with God. He's taking care of me. God's going to win this battle. He's going to give this Philistine to me, and I'm going to kill him. And what's interesting here, in one of the commentaries I read from Spurgeon, if you guys are not super familiar with Spurgeon, he's one of the big preachers in England at the time of I believe the Second Reformation, but he's one of the revivals that swept all of Europe. He was one of the prominent preachers during that time. What was particularly interesting I found about Spurgeon is he was originally something like that is what they called it in England at the time, and he actually wrote several papers and stuff about it, and basically his explanation was, you guys are just the world. You're doing the exact same thing the world is doing. You're no different than society in the church a lot of times, or entities that call themselves churches, I will say, which is people say they're churches, but they're acting like the world. And for people that actually want to do the will of God and are trying to listen to what God is saying, a lot of times they're telling you can't do it, and those types of things. And so anyways, on this particular passage, Spurgeon has this comment. He says, immediately before the encounter with the Philistine, he fought a battle which cost him far more thought, prudence, and patience. The word battle in which he had to engage with his brothers and with King Saul was a more trying ordeal to him than going forth in the strength of the Lord to smite the uncircumcised boaster. Many a man meets with more trouble from his friends than from his enemies, and when he has learned to overcome the depressing influence of prudent friends, he makes short work of the opposition of vowed adversaries. And like I said, as we compare the Israelites in this situation to Christians today, what we need to make sure that we don't do as Christians in the church is when somebody is going to do something, especially if they're convicted of God, hey, this is what God wants me to do. Don't be like the Israelites. Don't be like his brothers or King Saul standing in that person's way saying, you can't do it. God's not good enough. There's no way you can do this. And so that was, I thought, a very interesting observation about this particular part. And then we see the part where Saul gives David his armor, and so David tries it on. And it's interesting because a lot of the stories, the way I've heard it told, they say, well, it was too big for David, so he couldn't do it. But that's not what it says here. It says he put it on, and he tries to walk out, but he hadn't proved it, is what it says. Basically, he wasn't used to it. He hadn't used it and trained with it. And so he takes it off, and then he takes it off. And what's interesting, although the complete opposite of what's going on here, is if you use the exact phrase that David uses in parallel with a different passage in the Bible that talks about armor, which is in Ephesians, when it talks about the armor of God. And here, I guess it's the complete opposite of what's going on here, but how many times have you seen Christians, or in our own lives, have we seen where God gives us all this armor and he goes, hey, you're going into battle, here's all the armor, and we put on the armor that he's given us, the breastplate of salvation, the sword of the Spirit, the shield of faith, and we put it on, we get ready to go into battle, and we go, I can't use this. I haven't proved it. And that's what God's given us. But many times in our Christian lives, that's the truth. We go get ready, we get thrown into the battle or whatever, and we try to put on the armor of God, and we have to honestly say, I don't even know how to use this. I've never used it before. And that's going back to talking about how David talks about, hey, I've got this history with God. I've done this before. This is not the first time. And he's going with what he knows. God has given us that armor. We would be prudent to exercise those things that God has given us before it gets really, really, really bad. So then going to the next part in verse 40, it says, and he took his staff in his hand and chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook and put them in a shepherd's bag which he had, even in a scrip. And his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. And the Philistine came on and drew near unto David, and the man that bare the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, and ruddy, and of a fair countenance. And the Philistine said unto David, am I a dog that thou comest to me with staves? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give thy flesh to the fowls of the air, and to the beasts of the field. Then said David to the Philistine, thou comest to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee, and take thine head from thee, and I will give the carcasses of the hosts of Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air, and to the wild beasts of the earth, and all the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. Can you hit this slide, please, Justin? So this at the beginning here, this is kind of interesting, too, when you look at it. It talks about how David picks up these 5 stones from the brook. We've always heard that. But what you have to consider here is you can kind of see here, it's got the Israel camp up on the mountain ridge, the Philistine camp up on the mountain ridge, and it's got the valley down there. The creeks, or the brook's right in the middle of that valley. When he walks down from the camp, down the mountain to this plain where presumably the Philistines haven't run away, because it doesn't say they have, they're probably still down there on the other side, he has nothing. He's got a sling with no ammo, and he's got a stick, or his shepherd's staff, as it says. I think whatever it says there. Yes, his staff. So he goes down there. He's already halfway across the battlefield before he has anything. He has the faith that God's going to provide him his stones. He's got the faith that God's going to provide him and take care of him until he gets there. I mean, a lot of faith going on here. This is not some of the things you've seen. He walks out of Saul's tent and there's the brook and he picks up his things and then he goes to. No, he's halfway there before he even picks up his stones that he puts in his shepherd's bag. And so he goes down there, and this is kind of interesting as he's coming down. Presumably, the way it reads, Goliath is out there, and as David's approaching, he probably doesn't realize who he is or that he's a youth at this point, because it says he goes out there, and then when Goliath looks up and he sees that a youth, then he becomes indignant, is basically what it says. And what's interesting here is Goliath becomes indignant because I sent a boy against him, but he's already not following the rules that he himself set out. Because if you look back earlier when he gives his challenge, he goes, you send out one person and he'll fight me. Well, it says right here in verse 41, it says that the Philistine came on and drew near unto David, and the man that bare his shield went before him. So he's already bringing he brought a second guy. He's already cheating. Not to say that, why wouldn't he? But he's not even following his own rules that he made up. And then he sees David, and he gets mad, and he's like, what? Do you think I'm a dog? And he starts mocking him, and then he curses, says, David will rip your heart out and feed it to the birds. I don't know, whatever he says, something along those lines. But he goes, come over here. After he gets done mocking him, he goes, come over here, and I'll feed your flesh to the birds and the beasts of the air, or the beasts of the field. What's interesting here, and I'll point out why I think this may be true later, just a few verses later, is it seems like when Goliath comes out there, I don't know if it's after he gives his shout or his challenge again for the day or whatever, it seems like he might have popped a squat. I don't know if he has a chair out there. I don't know if he's sitting on the knee of his armor bearer. I don't know, whatever. But and I'll show you why in the next passage why I think that's the case. But anyways, he doesn't even do David the dignity of saying, I'm going to come over there and smack you. He goes, you come over here, and then I'll smack you. And then David says, he goes, hey, you're coming to me with all these physical things, the short sword and the spear and the shield, and I'm coming to you with God. Once again, he's pointing back, hey, this is about God. This is not about battles in general as we know them. This is about God. And he says, I'm coming to you in the name of the Lord, which, probably the Philistines are over there. They're already chuckling because this little kid came out to fight their, giant hero, champion. And he goes, hey, I see your offer. I got a counter offer for you. He goes, tell you what. First, I'm coming to you in God's name instead of with sticks. Second of all, first of all, I'm going to smite you. Then I'm going to cut your head off. And then, and probably at this point they're chuckling even harder. Ha! And then he goes, and he probably looks up at this point and he goes, and then I'm going to give the carcasses of all the Philistines to the birds and the beasts. And at this point, the one guy is like kind of punching his buddy over there on the Philistine army. And then the guy's laughing so hard he slips on a rock, falls halfway down the hill. I don't know, whatever. But that's the counteroffer he gives them. And then he gives the reasoning behind what he says. And he goes, that all this assembly may know. And what's interesting there, he goes, that and all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear. And as he just said, he goes, hey, I'm going to kill all of you. Clearly, he's not really talking to the Philistines that much, maybe, but he's going to kill them. I think he's probably talking more to the Israelites at this point. All the people who are scared and ran away, he's saying, I'm telling you what's going to happen, and then it's going to happen, and then you're going to know that God is real. And that he's probably talking to his brothers, his Israelite, relatives, and all these people, saying, hey, this is about God. It's like I keep saying, it's about God. It's not about strength and might. And then it's interesting that he does say, too, he's still, even though the Israelites are being scared, he brings them back into it. So he says, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you, talking to the Philistines, into our hands, not into my hand. He's still including his Israelite brothers, even though they are acting scared. And so into the last passage, and we'll wrap up pretty quick here, verse 48, and it came to pass when the Philistines arose and came and drew, and it came to pass when the Philistine arose and came and drew nigh to meet David, that David hasted and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took hence a stone and slang it and smote the Philistine in his forehead. And the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone and smote the Philistine and slew him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood upon the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of the sheath thereof and slew him and cut off his head therewith. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and of Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines until thou come to the valley and to the gates of Ekron, and the wounded of the Philistines fell down by the way of Sha'araim, even unto Gath and unto Ekron. So in this last piece of it, you see, and verse 48 right there is why I think that it's potentially possible that Goliath was possibly sitting, maybe he had a stool out there, I don't know. It says he arose and drew nigh unto David, which implies that he arose. And I don't know how many of you can arise when you're standing. I mean, so anyway, so he gets up and he goes, fine, whatever, twerp, I'm going to come and kill you. So he stands up and he's going towards David, and he sees something that probably shocks him. David doesn't freeze, he doesn't run away, which is probably what he expected when he stands up. You know, he's only this tall when he's sitting, and then he stands up and David sees him. He's probably expecting, I'll run away, whatever. And then he'll laugh and have a good chuckle. But David doesn't do that. He runs towards Goliath. He's running straight at him. And what's interesting is in a lot of Christians' lives, and I didn't realize this, but apparently this is a topic of consternation among some people, is they're like, well, shouldn't he have waited for God to do his work? And so what you see here is, yes, he had this conviction from God, but he's not sitting around waiting for God to do it. He has a conviction from God, and he's going to do it. So there's another quote from Spurgeon that he talks about in this one. He says, he's talking about the church of his day, but it applies to us, unfortunately, as well, I think, in America. And he says, the lazy bones of our Orthodox church cry, God will do his own work, and then they look out the softest pillow they can find and put it under their heads and say, the eternal purposes will be carried out. God will be glorified. That is all very fine talk, but it can be used with the most mischievous design. You can make opium out of it, which will lull you into a deep and dreadful slumber and prevent your being of any kind of use at all. And so, fortunately, we have a good pastor here who I think has taught us differently than that. But apparently this is a thing. Some people are like, well, he shouldn't have acted. He should have waited for God to do it. And there's, unfortunately, a lot of Christians in the world today who have that kind of an attitude, but it's not true. When God, especially if you feel this conviction, if God tells you to do something, you do it. So he runs at him, and then David gets his sling out, smacks Goliath in the forehead, as we all know. Now, one of two things is happening here. One, either Goliath needs to fire his helmet maker, because what kind of a helmet is leaving your whole forehead exposed? Or two, it's potentially possible, and I think both these are equally plausible. He took his helmet off when he's sitting down because he gives his challenge, and then he sits down and he takes off his helmet because it's hot. But in whatever case, he gets boom, rock in the forehead, and then he falls on his face. And I think that's particularly interesting that he falls on his face, because based on what we have of Goliath here, I don't think that he's running full tilt at David and he gets hit and he stumbles and he falls on his face. He's probably kind of sauntering because he's big, and probably, big guys that big don't really run, and he's got a lot of armor and stuff. He gets hit in the head. I don't know about you guys. I've gotten slapped in the face before. I don't usually go forward after that. So it seems like there might be something divine or miraculous going on here, the fact that he gets hit in the head and then he falls forward on his face. But anyways, so he does that, and then David, as it says here, he runs over, he pulls his sword out, and he cuts off his head. And so the Philistines' reaction to this is kind of interesting, but not really surprising when you look at it in light of what's actually happening here. And there's a bunch of people, and I've heard this one before, the Philistines are a bunch of whatever, and they didn't follow their rules because they said that they were going to be the servants of Israel, and then they just ran away instead. Well, sure, but David also changed the rules, right? Or at least the outcome. Because David tells them, he says, I'm coming in God's name. He goes, first I'm going to smite you, then I'm going to cut your head off, and then I'm going to kill all y'all's. And so what the Philistines are seeing here is, as they're chuckling and falling down the hill from laughter, is this kid goes, it's all about God. He doesn't say, I'm a mighty warrior and I'm going to do this. He said, this is about God, and I'm going to do this. And then what they're seeing is he smites them. And my guess would be at that time, there's probably a hush. And then he runs over there and he cuts off his head and he holds it up. And they go, ooh, what's the next thing? Oh, I like my carcass. See ya. I don't want my carcass to be fed to the birds. So David kind of changed the rules, whatever. I'm not blaming the Philistines. Even if someone made those stupid rules, I wouldn't want to follow them anyways. But that's what they're seeing. They're seeing David said, here's exactly what I'm going to do. And then they're seeing him do exactly what he said he's going to do. And they go, ooh. And in addition to that, he's saying this is about God, not a God, although in their mind it's maybe a God. But he's saying this is about God. And they were scared. They complete 180 from the last 40 days. They're scared, and they turn tail and run. And then the Israelites' reaction in the last verse, finally they get off their butt, and you see they go, same thing, though, as they've seen, and as David had pointed out, he goes, I'm going to do this so that you guys know that this is about God. And then they see the exact same thing. He said, I'm going to cut his head off, or he goes, I'm going to smite him, I'm going to cut his head off, and then I'm going to feed all the carcasses of the Philistines to the beasts of the field and the beasts of the field and the fowls of the air. And so they see the exact same thing. They see he smites them, he cuts his head off, and then at that point they're like, oh, maybe this God thing's real. And they finally get off their butts, they shout, they chase him down, they kill everybody. And so that's kind of what we see. So like I said, as we went through this, I wanted to kind of look at the different people groups and the different individual people in this story. And I think, obviously, as we probably knew in the past, David is the one we emulate in this story. We don't want to be like the Israelites, who we can be easily paralleled compared to the church of today, the people of God, people who make the motions, they show up, but they're not really doing anything. They don't have the faith in God, and then obviously don't be a Philistine or a pagan and challenge God. Not really smart, and then you die, and he kills you, and also you go to hell. So would recommend